I'm Bill Davison, local food systems educator. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm going to be talking about growing perennial vegetables in Illinois. And a colleague of mine, Kyle Cecil, is managing the chat function of this. So if you have issues or questions, he should be able to help you out as we go along. And then at the end, we'll try to answer whatever questions you have. So I thought I'd take a minute and just introduce myself and provide a little background for experience that I have related to perennial crops. So I have degrees in biology and started out in Illinois working as a biologist for the Nature Conservancy, and I was managing prairies and natural areas, and moved from that into vegetable farming and spent 7 years growing vegetables. So have experience on both sides of growing perennial plants or managing perennial plants, and also annual crops as vegetables. But I think one of the main reasons that you would consider growing perennials is that for relatively little investment, you can get years of harvest. So that's one of the main benefits of them. They tend to be a lot tougher and more resilient, and so there's a lot of benefits that way. And many people, when they think about this, they think of permaculture, which is an integrated version where if you take perennial crops and try to fully integrate them and maximize their uses, you are moving into the world of permaculture. But that all exists on a spectrum. So right now, I have a garden, and I am trying to move away from the linear garden beds, but I'm doing it very gradually. So I'm introducing perennials over time, and it still looks like a garden, but it's getting a little messier, a little more diverse, and in that process, a little more resilient. So I thought I would just offer a definition of permaculture or permanent agriculture, or as the University of Illinois calls some of their projects in this area, woody perennial polyculture. But it's a conscious design and maintenance of agriculturally productive ecosystems which have the diversity and resilience of natural ecosystems. And it's the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. And that's from a book by Bill Mollison, one of the founders of permaculture. So that's sort of the ideal scenario that is out there that some people strive for. So just move along here to talking about benefits of perennials and why you may want to consider them. The first being low maintenance. So again, they tend to be tough, require little care once they're established, and can give you years or decades of harvests. They also build the soil. So once you get a perennial established, you tend not to work the soil, which is a good thing. And then they drop leaves, they build up organic matter on the soil, and earthworms start to do a lot of the work for you of building soil fertility. They provide season extension in that they're often the first things to green up in the spring. So if you think about a garden, something like sorrel will start popping up in just a few weeks from now, and will be way ahead of any annual plant that you could get established. If you move into trees, you look at benefits with carbon sequestration. And then ecosystem benefits, where you begin to build up some vertical structure, moderate the climate, hold in moisture. You also provide habitat for beneficial insects, and you can have increased productivity because you are occupying multiple layers. You can have an upper canopy, mid canopy, and low canopy, all capturing sunlight and all producing for you. Of course, all those benefits come with some challenges, those being disease. So because these plants are rooted in place, you can't rotate them the same way. You have to be more aware and careful about disease and managing that and trying to keep them disease-free. It also can take years to establish because, as you see in this image here, this is an asparagus root system, which is quite dense and extensive. It takes time for that to develop. So you have to have some patience. And also flavor, question mark. So many of the annual crops that we are used to, potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, etc., are highly selected by people, and they're selected for what we prefer. So that's why you get tender, sweet greens and vegetables to eat. And that's not always the case with some of these perennials. So that's just something to be aware of. Flavors might be stronger, they might be tougher than what you're used to. And then with marketing, so anyone out there that is growing for market and considering, adding some of these crops into their mix, I think it's important that you appreciate the fact that, depending on how you market, most people gravitate towards what they know. And some of the crops that I'm going to be talking about, no one will have heard of. And that just makes marketing harder. So that's just something to be aware of. You probably don't want to go out and plant half an acre of some of these unusual crops unless you know people will pay for them. And then invasive tendencies. So some of these slides, you'll see the term low maintenance, which basically means they're really aggressive, something like an ostrich fern or Jerusalem artichokes. You have to be careful because once you plant some of these, they are very hard to get rid of. Another thing to consider when you're preparing your site, so this image here on the right, you'll see some more images of these roots, which come from a book called Root Development of Vegetable Crops. It was published in 1927. These are actual drawings of different crops that scientists basically dug up the root systems and analyzed them. So this is, I believe, a carrot, and you see the difference between the left and the right. The root system on the right is grown in compacted soil, so you see that the roots are concentrated in the first 4 inches or so. So this is just going to show you that because these plants are going to be there a long time, you want to take care to get your pH right, balance your nutrients, make sure you don't have perennial weeds like Canada thistle and bindweed sitting there because it'll be much harder to deal with them later. And you want to try to remove compaction so you get the full benefit of these plants accessing deeper reaches of the soil and the nutrients stored there and the drought tolerance they get from being more deeply rooted. So this is another image from this book showing roots. So these, starting on the left here, this is the root of a beet plant, which is used to be a perennial plant in the wild, and we have selected it to be a biennial. But it illustrates the point that if you look at the first picture, the smallest roots on the left, that's a beet plant at 6 weeks of age, which is the time you can harvest a baby beet. And you get this mild, tender root. But then as you move into 10 weeks, this image in the middle, you see much more extensive roots. And then at 16 weeks, you see a dramatic increase in the structure of the root system. So it's just showing an example of how roots develop over time. And if you were to have a perennial plant develop this extensive root system, that's where a lot of the benefits come from. A lot of the resilience comes from that vigorous, deep root system. So with perennial vegetables, there's lots of different types, just like with annuals. Some of these crops you're eating leaves, some of them just the shoots like you would asparagus. And then there are edible fruits that you eat as a vegetable. There are beans in the mix, so different pods and beans and flowers. Some produce aerial roots off of vines, and then different types of root crops. So now what I'm going to do is just go through a series of profiles of different plant species and sort of more focused on the unusual types of crops. So if anyone is looking for a lot of information about asparagus and rhubarb, I'm not going to do too much with them because there's a lot of information out there about those two crops. Some of our other educators have done programming on them, and it's relatively easy to find information. So most of what I'll talk about, there's not as much information out there, and I'm just trying to introduce these to you and let you know my experience and some of the potential that I think these crops have. So I'll start with alliums, onions basically, garlic. There's tremendous potential with alliums, and this is a crop that if you're already a gardener or a vegetable grower selling into markets, it's pretty easy to add some diversity with alliums into your mix. The image here shows potato onions, which are related to shallots. So this is a type of a multiplier onion. Basically divides underground like a potato. So you plant a single bulb and you get, ideally you get this cluster of sometimes 3 to 4 inch onions underground. And the nice thing about these is that they store for up to 12 months, sometimes even a little longer. So if you're a home gardener and you're interested in growing your own food, it's possible to achieve allium independence. That's where I've been for the past few years, where you don't have to buy onions anymore. And if you like to cook, it's really nice to have your own onions. So a crop like this, when you run out of your storage onions, these come into play. And then when you look at other crops, like this is called an Egyptian walking onion. This is another type of perennial onion, which is the top setting type. So you see these little red bulbs at the top of the plant. The plants will fall over and it will be propagated by those. So these and some of the perennial scallion type onions can give you very early green onions. So between these and garlic, which also can give you an early type of green allium to eat, you can have your own onions year-round. This is just an example of a perennial bunching onion or scallion that would come up really early in the spring. So it can help you get an early crop into the market if you're selling vegetables, or just give you early onions to eat out of your garden. And then the image on the right from the same book just shows you an onion root system. So lovage, this is an example of basically a giant celery relative. It has a strong flavor, so this would be an example of something that you would definitely want to check out. You would want to sample it before you plant a lot of it and make sure that you like it if you're going to eat it, or if you're selling it, that your customers like it. It's something that you would tend to eat early when it first leaves out, when it's more mild, and then as it matures in the summer, it gets stronger and stronger. So then you move into, you can use the seeds, or if you let it bloom, many of these plants attract beneficial insects and have, you get that type of a benefit from them. And this plant can get quite large, 6 feet tall and really wide. So you have to take that into account if you're going to establish something like this. This is burdock root. So if you're looking at this picture and think that those roots look like they're 4 feet long, that's because they are 4 feet long. So that would be one of the drawbacks to this. So this is great burdock, or Arctium lapa. This is different than the weed. So a lot of people think, well, you're growing burdock, you're just growing a weed. But this is the cultivated version of that. So these roots are not like a carrot. They're not brittle, tender, and you typically would not eat them fresh. They're for cooking. But for many people, they have a nice flavor. They're part of a traditional Japanese cuisine. So the hardest thing about these is harvesting them. You have to decide how you're going to get that very long root out of the ground. For me, I go down about 15 inches and then I give up and snap it off. So if you have loose soil, sandy soil, it makes it easier. But it's certainly an interesting crop to consider. So this is Skirret. This is a little more esoteric. It used to be common in American gardens, but it got replaced by potatoes. So this is a perennial. The roots are about the size of a pencil, and you treat them like potatoes. And again, you can see by this picture, it has small white flowers which attract beneficial insects. And then chicory, this is another one that, depending on the variety, it may or may not be perennial. Some of them are perennial. So this image is of radicchio. It also includes endive, escarole, dandelions are in the same family. These are crops which, again, you have to be careful about the flavor. Most Americans don't like bitter flavors. These do have a bitter component. So I enjoy them, and there are ways to moderate the flavor by soaking in ice water and cooking, but this is not lettuce, so this is not something that you would grow and expect people to necessarily buy from you. You have to be a little more careful, but they're very resilient and add interesting color and flavor, especially something like a salad mix. You know, it's easier to add them in there where they're diluted. So that's the flower, which you probably see along roadsides. Again, once it flowers, it attracts beneficial insects. This is something you may have heard of. So Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes. This is a native root crop. It's a type of sunflower. This is also an example of something that you want to make sure you really want it before you plant it, because it's very hard to get rid of. So you see the tubers it forms on the left here, and then the plants. And the other thing to note is those plants are probably 8 to 10 feet tall. So this is a very vigorous crop that sets a lot of small tubers and will continue to resprout from the tiniest tuber. And it'll spread out, and it can take over where you don't want it to. So you have to be careful. But it has a great story. It's very nutritious. The other thing to be aware of, it contains a type of a starch that's called inulin, which is hard to digest. So it does good things for you. It increases calcium absorption, and it can improve the health of your digestive tract. However, it also can cause some distress in your intestinal tract, and you have to be aware of that, especially if you're selling it to people. People are not going to replace potatoes with this, so you have to get a feel for that before you really commit to it. Okay, so this is a root crop called Scorzonera, or black salsify. So you see the roots on the left there, and then the leaves on the right. The leaves and the roots are edible. The leaves are somewhat like lettuce, and the roots taste similar to oysters, believe it or not. So this is probably closer to burdock than carrots. This is a cooking root, not something you would eat raw. And then Western front perennial kale. So this is a variety of kale. So again, kale was a perennial plant in the wild that we domesticated and fit into our gardens, but there are perennial versions out there. So this was bred by Tim Peters out in the Pacific Northwest. About half of the plants are perennial, and if you grow a red Russian kale, this will be similar to you. When you see the leaves in the lower right there, they look like that. But it has the potential to survive the winter and be a perennial kale plant for you. And so this is something that if you were to introduce this and learn how to grow it and manage it, you potentially would have relatively easy acceptance if you're trying to sell this to customers, in that it looks like what they're used to seeing as a form of kale. Now this next plant is called sea kale, and this is not in the brassica family. This is Crambe maritima. This is a different plant. But this is one where you would blanch this early spring growth when they're quite small. It can live for a long time, up to 10 years. And you can eat young leaves, but it is not as refined and tender as our domesticated types of brassicas are. And it gets quite large. This is an image of it in its native habitat, growing in a rocky beach near the ocean. So again, this would be something that is interesting and has potential, and you know, someone could explore that if you wanted to see how it did for you. So Ostrich Fern, this is an example, again, low maintenance native edible plant. So low maintenance means it's really aggressive. It's colony forming. The good news is that you can grow it in shade, so it's not necessarily going to compete with your sun-loving vegetables, but you have to be aware of the fact that it will spread underground. And it tends to have a short harvest season. So if you look at this next picture here, this is when you're harvesting it, right when it first comes out of the ground. So you see the bowl on the right where you just snap off the top of the what's called a fiddlehead, and then that is what you're using. So this would have a very narrow harvest window. This is not something you would count on to have a long harvest period. And groundnut here, or potato bean, Apios americana. This is native to the eastern United States. So this is basically a bean, a vine that will grow up about 8 feet or so. You can grow it in the sun or the shade. The tubers are about egg size, so this is an image of the tubers showing you what the roots look like underground. They're high in protein, 3 times the protein of potatoes, but they take 2 to 3 years to establish. So this would be a relatively slow process getting these established. And then they prefer moist soil, and you would need to provide something for them to climb on, or they'll sprawl over the ground. And the tubers need to be cooked, and the flavor is reminiscent of a potato crossed with a peanut. I've never eaten them, but that's the description I have for them. So this next one is called Chinese artichoke. It's related to mint. You can see the leaves there of the plant. You can tell it's related to mint. These are small tubers that can grow in full sun or shade. They're very crisp and sweet, and you can eat these raw or cooked. But if you have washed many roots, you can imagine looking at these bumpy little roots that it would take a lot of time to wash these compared to something like a potato, which I think is why people have tended to move towards potatoes over time and neglected these type of root crops. But if you want to try them, they certainly have potential. And then beans. So there are types of beans like runner beans, Phaseolus coccineus. So scarlet runner is another name for these. These are, some varieties of these are perennial. And you can see from this image they're quite vigorous. The roots survive down to 23 degrees, and they can live for up to 20 years. And the nice thing from plants like this, you get you can eat green beans, you can eat the flowers, you can eat dry beans. Even the leaves and tubers are edible. So it's very flexible in that way. It's beautiful. It's an ornamental. That's typically how they're used. Orange flowers and have visual appeal in that way. And then you see the bean pods on the right, sort of a flat bean. And if you let them go to dry beans, this is one example of what the beans look like. They can be quite large and colorful. And they're also diverse, lots of different varieties, so different sizes, shapes, and colors in the beans. And then this next one, this may be something that people have experience with, or at least have heard of before. Sorrel. So this is a green. It's also good for attracting beneficial insects. The problem, again, especially for Americans, is that this is sour. It has a sour flavor. So it's certainly not like lettuce, but it's very early. It can give you likely the first greens of the season, and it's great for cooking, for making soup, because the leaves tend to dissolve, and then the flavor gets diluted a bit. So I'm a big fan. So this is a typical green sorrel, but there are other varieties. So you can get the red vein variety, which is a little more colorful and would stand out if you're trying to market this at a farmer's market or to chefs. Um, so definitely a lot of potential with sorrel. It's a great plant. The next one here, stinging nettle. So some of you may see this and think, well, that's just a weedy native plant that grows in floodplains and is really irritating if it touches your skin. And that's true, it is. It also, to me anyway, tastes really good. It's a spring tonic. You can grow it in your garden, or you can forage for it. There certainly is no shortage of it if you're anywhere near a wooded area or even a creek. So you would just harvest the top of this plant. It's very resilient, but it does have stinging hairs. And it can be irritating, but if you wear gloves and you blanch it in water, it dissolves the acid on the hairs, and then it just turns into a green that you would use like spinach. And then I just thought I would mention mushrooms, because if you're interested in this type of system, it makes a lot of sense to add mushrooms, because you're probably going to be mulching with wood chips, or you're going to have shady areas. So there's been a tremendous explosion in availability of different types of mushrooms and information about propagating them. So the image on the left are shiitake mushrooms grown on logs. So I have done this, and it's an amazing product. They taste great, but it's a lot of work to inoculate the logs. But if you had an interest in that, it certainly is a relatively easy thing to sell if you're trying to market them. You just have to read through on the appropriate time to cut the logs at the right time and inoculate them, and then manage them. So what you see here, they're stacked to facilitate harvesting. So you manage the logs differently when they're first incubating and the mushrooms are colonizing the log. You kind of stack them together. But then as they start to produce, you can do some variation on this where you basically give them space. And then you can see how many mushrooms you can get. And you can do this outside, just in a shaded area, or if you already have a high tunnel or are looking at getting a high tunnel, this would be something that could be added into your high tunnels to increase the season for these. And then the image on the right, those are wine cap mushrooms grown on wood chip. So if you don't want to pursue cutting logs and inoculating logs, you can just use wood chips. So if you are mulching with them, all you do, you can buy the spawn, bags of inoculated sawdust basically, and you spread the spawn on the fresh wood chips. And if all goes well, you'll get flushes of different kinds of mushrooms. So wine cap, oyster, and lots of other varieties are being propagated now. And there's different companies doing that. There's research being done in southern Illinois too. There's a company in Wisconsin, which is one of the closest ones that I know of, that provides these services. It's called Field and Forest Products. So that's one place you could check out. There's lots of others. So this is a project I'm working on that sort of integrates a lot of what I've just talked about. It's called the Refuge Food Forest. It's in Normal, Illinois. I'm based out of Bloomington Normal, so I'm partnering with the town of Normal and their parks department. And this May 9th, hopefully, we're going to be planting this food forest. And so the idea here is that we try to integrate all of these plants into that idealistic permaculture, woody perennial polyculture type scenario. So the pattern you see on the image here, those are all tilled beds, and we're going to plant a perimeter of hazelnuts, some chestnut on the side, and then concentric circles of different fruit trees and berries and herbs all together. And this is going to be a community resource. It's free, it's open to the public. My main impetus for starting this was really wanting to get kids outside eating fruits and vegetables and right off of the plants and exposing them to, how good a food can be. So part of this started from a farmer in Wisconsin named Mark Shepard who wrote this book. It's called Restoration Agriculture. And basically it's about this system that I just described where you try to integrate plants into a holistic assemblage that makes sense, where you get synergistic effects working on your behalf, basically. And his work inspired Kevin Wolz, who's a PhD student at the University of Illinois and is doing research on woody perennial polyculture, basically what we're trying to do here with the food forest. So Kevin is a consultant and help design the refuge food forest, and we're working together to get that established. But I'm just going to branch out into nut crops here for a minute and just talk about a couple that are a part of this system. So this is a chestnut, and Kevin's interest and the interest of others is in partly based on the fact that from a nutritional standpoint, a chestnut is superior to corn. So there is a potential for it to replace corn from a nutritional standpoint. So if you think about the implications of that, if it were possible to, even to a very small degree, begin to provide some human calories from a perennial tree crop, there's tremendous benefits to that. The same thing goes for hazelnuts, which is what you see here. Hazelnuts can replace soybeans. So the idea is that by studying this system, working to increase its efficiency and markets for this type of a system, it is possible to move in that direction where you are able to market perennial crops like this. And again, continuing on in this vein of perennial crops, so this is perennial wheat. And this is being developed by Wes Jackson at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, who is an incredible visionary and has been working on this for decades now. But the image you see of the root system on the left here, so you see it says hybrid perennial wheat, and then you see over 9 feet of dense roots. That's an actual plant, an actual root system. And then on the right, you see what everyone is eating, what we're deriving our calories from. So if you think about a plant's ability to extract nutrients from the soil, the resilience of a plant, the fact that it is not tilled every year, there's tremendous benefits in this. And you see the picture of the plants on the top right, it kind of looks like a prairie, minus the wildflowers, in that it's a solid stand of tall grass. The problem is in the third picture, where you see someone holding the seeds in their hand. The seeds are tiny. They're not like the wheat that the annual wheat crops that we're used to seeing. And so that is what they're selecting for. That's what they're breeding, is to get larger seeds. So just this next slide it's more of a disclaimer. If you get into these perennial crops, there's lots of esoteric crops out there that aren't commonly used as a food source, and so you just want to be careful when you move into those. Almost everything that I have described is commonly eaten, and that you don't find descriptors attached to them where they say mildly toxic. Some of the other ones you do. So basically, you just want to be careful, eat small amounts at first, and see how you react, because people react differently to different crops. So here I have, this is a list of, this is some potential sources, and this is not intended to endorse these, and these are places that I have ordered from, but there are lots of others. This is just intended to show you how you could get started if you wanted to begin to look into some of these plants and different varieties. These are places where you can find them. And I have a list of books here. So one thing about these perennial crops, this is not like tomatoes and our common vegetables where there's extensive literature on them. There aren't as many technical articles about these perennial crops, so a lot of the information that's out there comes from some of these books, and they are well researched, but they're not necessarily peer-reviewed articles. So this author here, you see Eric Tonesmeyer. This book, Paradise Lot, it's a great book to read if you just want to hear about his experience establishing these plants in a small urban garden and what he learned in that process. Some of these other books are a little more technical, but if you really want to explore the potential and get a thorough understanding of these crops, you could continue on into the technical literature for that. So these are just intended as an introduction to this topic. And the last image here, so this is just contact information for me with my email. And so I have a Facebook page, University of Illinois Extension, Local Food Frontier. It's very active, and I generally post about the food system, but there's a lot of food forest information that gets shared through this site. So if you do have an interest in that sort of a thing, this is one way to get connected to what's happening with food forests, because they are developing throughout Illinois, the Midwest, and across the country. And it's just one example of this interest in perennial vegetables. And then as far as perennial wheat or grain in general, I have a group page on Facebook, the Grand Prairie Grain Guild, which is a group where we're sharing information about local grain, not so much perennial wheat, although some farmers have planted it and are growing it in Illinois. It's more about developing access to food grade markets for grains, which can be an important component to a farm. So even for new people who are starting out growing vegetables, it's worth at least thinking through the potential that grains have to offer as a way to diversify your farm, allow you to have something to market year round, and it's relatively straightforward and easy to make a profit compared to some other things that people are looking into. So that's my interest and plug for the Grand Prairie Grain Guild. We can move on to answering questions if people have any about what we discussed.
Okay, do you see that one from Jerry? Where's a good place to get a start of runner beans?
Runner beans are in a lot of commercial seed catalogs, so it's not that hard to find them. I think you would just have to look, inquire about their perennial nature if that's an interest of yours, because there are varying degrees of being perennial within that species.
Teacup asks, are the pests and diseases with these crops similar to conventional vegetables?
In general, you have less pressure, and these plants are tougher and more resilient, but they also, you can't rotate them. So for something like disease pressure, you have to be careful about trying to managing them to minimize that over time. But in terms of insects and other pests, they tend to be more resilient in that way.
Teacup Farm asks, are these more resilient to drought?
Yes. In general, the answer is yes. The root systems are larger, deeper. You tend to develop shade as you build this type of a system, so they are more resilient. And because most annual vegetables are pretty fragile plants.
We have another one. Are any of these better for sandy soil?
Yeah, there are. If you look through this, you will find some that are either listed as being drought tolerant or actually preferring sand. So there are some preferences in that way, but also some of them prefer moist soil, so would not do well in sand. So you'll just have to look at the preferences for each variety.
Next one, Bill, was can all of these plants be grown in Illinois?
They all can be grown. Some of them, like the runner beans, depending on if you're in the north or the south and how you manage them, they may or may not survive the winter, or sometimes a lot of times a plant might die back to the roots and then resprout. So they wouldn't be perennial in the same way they would be, say, down in Florida, but they may still work in Illinois.
And
So,
probably too, from Carbondale to Kankakee, that's a long distance, so they probably grow differently and throughout different places in Illinois. Would that be safe to say?
oh yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then down at the bottom of the chat box, two of them. One I threw in there was people were wanting to know how big is that space for the garden you were talking about in Bloomington, the food forest.
The food forest is a little over an acre, so it's a pretty sizable planting for this type of project. It's going to be thousands of and lots of time and effort into managing that system.
Bill, how long do you think that, if you would call that site, that project demonstration mature, how many years will that be?
The initial wave of maturity will come from the berries. So in 2 to 3 years, they will be mature. Then the fruit trees, that's 4, 5, 6 years down the road before they begin to produce. And then the chestnut trees and the hazelnuts are even later. So full maturity for the entire system, we're looking at a decade or more. So it's a long-term project.
Teacup farm question. Can you cover that one for everyone?
Yes. So do you suggest irrigation to initially establish the crops? It depends on the year. It depends on what you plant and the year. I think, given that these are long-term crops, it is worth looking into irrigation the first season at least to get them established, and then after that their needs diminish. But if we have normal rainfall, and the plants look like they're doing well, you don't necessarily have to irrigate them, especially if you can mulch them. But if they look like they're stressed, I would say it's worth investing in giving them enough water just to get them through that first year. So similar pH. Yeah, I think in general, a neutral pH like you would have for your vegetable garden, 6.8 is a safe bet. Some particular crops may shift one way or another, but in general, it is similar to your garden crops, your annuals. Permaculture book. Well, there are so many permaculture books out there. I think I mentioned Bill Mollison was my initial quote. He's written lots of different sort of manuals over the past couple decades. So if you have an interest in permaculture, you can just use whatever search engine you want. Type that in. There will be no shortage of information and books on that.
Hey, Bill, can I offer on the pH thing? Just like with asparagus, strawberries, and things like that, since these are all long-lived crops, you want to make sure you address your pH issues before you establish the crop. So that once they're growing, it's going to be a lot harder to do that. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Brenda said she has a problem with iris borers in Jerusalem artichokes. Huh. Yeah, I've seen that. I used to grow them and would see, tunnels in the roots of some of them. I'm not sure what can be done to control them. I always had so many that I had more than I needed, so I didn't pay that much attention to the damage. But I would think maybe if you have space, rotate or moving away from that area and looking into what the host plants are for iris borers, if they're more than just iris, and if you really want Jerusalem artichokes, look at cleaning those out, getting rid of them.
Bill, there's a question, can you talk about some long-lived perennial herbs that might fit in, be qualified as long-lived perennials that might be best to have in these systems too?
Yeah, I didn't do a lot with herbs, but there's a whole other category of plants to look into. Things like oregano, mint, garlic chives. Chives are all perennials that will work in the same scenario. And oftentimes, what people do, so if you establish some of these larger perennial plants, you fit herbs in and around them, and there's a lot of benefits to that diversity. So yeah, there's a whole group of herbs that if you like to eat them or have markets for them, it's great to incorporate them into this system.
Garlic chives is another one of those that it's pretty aggressive itself. It's a really neat plant, but it kind of reminds me of the artichoke. You've got to manage it, or you'll have a garden full of the crop, won't you?
Yeah, it's amazing though how that attracts insects, honeybees and others. When that is in full bloom, I think they come from miles around to visit that. So there's a question about the spacing on the root grafts. It was a little hard to see because that was from an old book, and it was different for different ones. But some of those roots went down 10 feet. So I think like the beets that I showed, they started at 2 feet and the graft went down to 6 or 8 feet. Asparagus was like 10 feet. So they were different scales. There was no uniform scale for those. I was just trying to show basic principles, and I thought it was just kind of interesting to be able to see the actual structure of the root system. But you can find that whole article online if you want to see. There's a lot more information and photographs or line drawings, I guess, in that article.
Bill, are any of these plants, are they all hand harvested? Are there any of them that are commercially harvested in some sort of mechanized way, or is this pretty much a hand harvest situation?
A lot of it is hand, although some of the root crops, I don't see any reason why, if you're set up to like mechanically dig potatoes, you couldn't go through Scorzonera, Salsify, even Burdock, with an undercutter and have the machine do all that work for you.
Okay, looks like we got all the way through them, Bill.
Okay.
And hope to see everybody next week for our next in the series. I don't have that in front of me what that is, but I'm seeing a lot of familiar names on here. And just to note, this was the most this year. We have exceeded even last year's record goal of participants in these webinars, and we appreciate hearing from all of you on the topics and what have you. So thanks for being on. Thanks, Bill, for presenting, and we'll see everybody next week.